Okay, I think we have the main group of our attendees. Others will probably join us over the next few minutes. As director of the Las Casas Institute, it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this joyful, I think, online occasion to celebrate with Edward Hadas and to congratulate him on the publication of his new book, Counsels of Imperfection. A book launch like this not only allows us to recognize the hard work that goes into a text's composition and revision, it also stimulates us. It whets the intellectual appetite, inviting us to savor the questions broached, the truth advanced, the truth debated. To that end, this evening, Edward is going to briefly introduce or summarize his new book, its main themes and topics. And then I'm very pleased to say that Professor Stephen Bullivant of St. Mary's University, Twickenham, has kindly agreed to respond. And after that, we're all invited to join the discussion and to put questions. So Edward, congratulations, and over to you.
Thank you, Richard. And just on the very small technical note, if you can put questions in the Q&A, then they will be read aloud. And I think the plan is to record this. It is being recorded. So the questions will be read. And if you don't want your name mentioned, please signify that for the recording. Okay, I'm going to talk for maybe 20 minutes. It's usually hard to shut me up. This book was supposed to be 200 pages and it ended up twice as long as that, but I promise not to overwrite by quite that much. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about sort of why I wrote this book and why I think it's a little bit different from other books on Catholic social teaching, and a little bit also about what I hope that readers will find after they've read the book, why they might think about it as a sort of how to approach Catholic social teaching. So I'm going to start by talking, as I said, about why I wrote this book. And I suppose one sort of obvious answer is that I'm just the kind of person that likes to write books. I wrote one on economics before. I've written one on money and finance. It's looking for a publisher right now. And I have another one on the nature of modernity that's finding its way into completion at some point. So it's something that I like to do. I like to think about ideas and try and organize them into a kind of book-like form. More sort of why Catholic social teaching is a better question. And there the answer is really very much that I am a convert to Catholicism, and Catholic social teaching, I would be a lie to say that it had any role whatsoever in my conversion. But I will say that I discovered it a few years after I converted. In fact, remember the moment because I was living in France at the time, and they had a pile of the latest encyclical in 1991 by Pope John Paul II, Centesimus Annus, that at the Paris Charles de Gaulle airport bookstore, now seems like such a long time ago that a French airport bookstore would think this was the kind of thing you put on a big sales table. But there it was, so I bought a copy. And I thought, this is really interesting. Here is a really interesting interaction between the Pope and the modern world. And it was thoughtful and insightful in various ways and managed to be both very contemporary and very Catholic, and helped me think a lot about the role of governments and the economy and what was wrong with communism and the sort of questions that St. John Paul II was very remarkably insightful about. So was a kind of odd love affair that started then with this domain and has extended. And as I came to read more about Catholic social teaching, not just the various papal documents and some other lesser magisterial documents, but also the some of the textbooks and articles and so forth, I came to feel that a lot of the people writing about it said things that I didn't feel really were very helpful. They didn't seem to understand, at least not understand it correctly, perhaps didn't understand the way that I did, the kind of richness and the purpose of this teaching. So I felt that Catholic social teaching was the way I thought of it was sort of both underappreciated and misrepresented. It was underappreciated in the sense that the intellectual and political and cultural capacity that it had to help Catholics and help the world think about important issues wasn't really understood either by Catholics or by non-Catholics. To a large extent, and that it was misrepresented in the sense that many people brought in political preconceptions, particularly political or economic. They love free markets, they hate free markets, they love democracy, they hate democracy, and basically would take these preconceptions and look for what sometimes known as proof texts within the encyclicals and say, well, you see, it says here that no Catholic can be a socialist, or it says here that all Catholics should do this or do that. And that's I felt I really didn't get at the richness of this. So I thought I should write a book about it. And as I wrote it, it became more and more fun. And I mentioned that not to demonstrate the strangeness of my personality, but because I hope that some of that fun is felt by the reader. I had to dig into a lot of topics I didn't know very much about because Catholic social teaching covers a lot of topics. And you learn things about, for example, the history of the prison system. You learn things about the changes in the way the church has responded to the modern world, which I'll come back to. And it just struck me as a kind of adventure of its own to try and understand how this thing that is both divine and human, the Catholic Church, tries to deal with the world in its modern incarnation, as it were, its modern existence, with its lights and shadows. And that was a very adventure of various sorts. So I think I've already now said it's a love affair and an adventure. It sounds pretty dramatic. So why is this book different? Turning to that question. Well, I think one of the ways in which Catholic social teaching is often presented and in manuals and even to some extent in the compendium of the Catholic social teaching, which is published by the Justice and Peace within the Vatican, it's often presented as a series of teachings that is somehow seen as parallel to or similar to or even identical to in authority to the kind of teachings that you're used to if you study theology at all, of any sort. So, what happens when the priest consecrates the host? Well, we have some words, we have some descriptions that are official. We are going to argue perhaps what these words mean, what exactly they're saying. Does it mean this? Does it mean that? But there's a kind of statement of dogma that you can't really argue with as a Catholic. You have to accept it. And the same would be true of Christology, of Trinitarian theology, of grace, of lots of things in the theological range that the Vatican usually or often speaks about. And I think it's very tempting, and some quite distinguished scholars have spent a great deal of time trying to figure out how binding these teachings are, what level of authority they have, are they infallible, are they something less than that? And they definitely less than infallible. Some serious problems if all these teachings were infallible from the beginning to the end. But can they change? What does it mean to have a teaching on a social document? It is, I think, often misunderstood because of this analogy. And so I wanted to show that the teachings, even teachings that are often presented as firm principles, for example, the preferential option for the poor, or even to some extent, say, the dignity of human nature, they're much more like guidelines and statements of dogma. They're ways of trying to think about things. And I think that focusing too much on these principles, what is, say, for example, a debate that rages, what is the common good? How does Catholics think of the common good? That trying to get a firm official definition is in itself a misguided effort. I'm trying in this book to show that what these are counsels, they're pieces of advice, guiding principles. And they are, well, to use the word that I use in my title, they're imperfect. They're counsels of imperfection. And they're imperfect, not in the sense that they're not true, that we should not, it is certainly true that we should prefer the poor over the rich as Christians and put the poor first. But they're imperfect in the sense that that's not going to give us a complete or perfected guideline to action. We're going to be dealing with things in a very messy world. All the questions that Catholic social teaching deals with take place in a world that is stained with sin, where people strive often in very confused ways to be good, where there are different goods that conflict almost always, and you have to make choices among them, where things are changing, where we live in ignorance often, where we have challenges that stretch around the globe, that stretch from past into future. All of those things are part of the world that Catholic social teaching is trying to address. So I want to get that in this text. I wanted to try and get that imperfection and try and show that this is always a doctrine that's a work in progress, a response to various different things in the world, and more of a kind of framing or outline than a kind of firm, definitive topic. So that would be one of the differences. Another is, and I'm rather critical in the sense that I don't always think that everything that every pope has said about every issue is 100% correct. And I'm willing to accept, in fact, I try and go out of my way to point out ways in which the church's teaching has evolved, even changed or reversed on certain issues. Again, teaching in the sense of trying to make sense of the modern world and its practices. One of the examples that I use at the beginning is I talk about democracy, which the church was very skeptical of in the 19th century, the popes, and eventually became quite favorable to. Even more extreme would be the response to say human rights, which the church rejected to a large extent for a long time and now is a great endorser, or freedom of religion, which in the old days it used to be said that error has no rights. But really, by the time you get to the 1970s, it is fair to say that erroneous religious beliefs have a certain kind of right in the minds of the church. So I want to get at this idea of why it's worth following a teaching that changes, that's not perfect. And I wanted to show again that this is a kind of dialogue with modernity where the church learns from modernity, teaches modernity, and always has something interesting to say, or almost always. And I do go out of my way to point out to things where the church was very slow, the most shocking examples is anti-Semitism, where the church did not notice the giant change in the position of Jews in society in the 19th and early 20th century, and did not really change what was already a very antiquated idea of how to deal with the question of religious diversity and the question of the Jewish role in society, leaving aside the theology, although one can't really leave it aside. I do talk about that. And so I want to point that out, that the social teaching sometimes doesn't work very well. But sometimes it's quite brilliant. I also want to point that out, from Leo the 13th in the end of the 19th century to the present, the capacity to see that both liberalism and socialism are doctrines that spring from a common understanding of human nature, of the purpose of society, and of the nature of government in some ways. And that's been a brilliant insight, a very prophetic insight. And the capacity of this, more broadly, the capacity of the teaching to avoid ideology of one sort or another, for example, liberalism or authoritarianism, has been something that is sometimes tested a little, but has been actually a very prophetic and helpful voice in the cacophony of the modern world. I also talk a little bit about, and this is again in terms of breadth of the various dimensions of the teaching that it teaches to Catholics and also aims at the modern world. And there's a kind of tragic dialogue where, when the modern world might have listened to the church at the end of the 19th century, the church was very antagonistic. There was a brief period of reconciliation in the 1950s and 60s. And then when the church wanted to talk to the modern world, as it does now, the modern world hardly listens. Another sort of unique selling point that I would mention is that I've tried to tie in a lot of four basic ways of talking about the teaching. I talk about it in terms of sort of human nature as being striving for the good, but stained by sin. I never go far from that. I bring in the scriptural evidence for the teachings, and sometimes the lack of scriptural evidence. One of the main themes of this book is that the modern world is so different in so many ways from anything that came before, that the Bible is in many ways very difficult to tie in directly, and sometimes even indirectly, to the very questions that the social teaching addresses. I also try and put in the history of the doctrine, but also the history that surrounds the doctrine. Why was this doctrine developed? What were the challenges it was trying to address? And there's also quite a bit about philosophy. So we have human nature, scripture, history, and philosophy, all trying to be woven in. And so while this is a fairly long book, it is a very ambitious book in the scope of topics that it tries to cover, because I use all four of these ideas, and human nature is throughout, but the scripture, history, and philosophy, each section of the topics that I cover, which are, roughly speaking, economics, government, ecology, and miscellaneous stuff, and then family teaching, all get their scriptural, historical, and philosophical treatment. The family teaching is probably worth a special mention because often that's separated out from the Catholic social teaching, often by people who like one and not the other. And the family teaching, I call it family teaching because that's the social aspect that underlies the very controversial sexual teachings of the church. And so I try and present not the moral arguments, although those come up about sexuality, but the concept of putting the family first in society, and particularly putting children first, as a way of framing the debate that, from a Catholic perspective, of how we should approach family issues of the sort that have become so controversial. So that's a fairly good summary of what I think of the key selling points of this book. What I'd like the readers to get out of it, if they get through this thing, is maybe 4 points. One is particularly for Catholics trying to think about Catholic social teaching. And I think that, I guess I keep saying this even in this introduction, but it's so important to me that I feel I need to repeat it, is that this isn't really like the kind of debates that you often would get or still get if you're trying to find out what does the Catholic Church say about X. You know, I mean, I remember of going to dinner with a priest once who was speaking in a very loud voice about what it meant for a marriage to be actually consummated. And there was a very detailed description of what that meant, which I really didn't feel the rest of the audience in the restaurant was going to be appreciating too much. But it was a very Catholic moment because, you know, it had gone through the canon law for a few centuries, and they had a lot of words to decide whether a marriage had been consummated or not. Or, you know, again, sort of whether a consecration is valid. You have a lot of words and something very precise. Social teaching just isn't like that. It's an attempt to develop sort of habits of thinking, a way of looking at the world, looking for key points in controversial issues to try and understand how to think about, say, economic activity, how to think about what the form and purpose of government is. So it's not going to tell you whether a government is good. It's not going to give you a checklist that you can use. In a very current example, I've written a piece about COVID post this book and what Catholic social teaching teaches. And it's interesting to me to read other people trying to do the same thing. And we come to quite different conclusions using basically the same principles as to what the church gets out of the experience of the COVID pandemic and the restrictions and responses to it from governments and from society. And I think that's healthy in the sense that all of us are working from the same basic principles, trying to frame the debate, coming to quite different conclusions. But I think we can at least argue with each other and talk with each other and learn from each other, because the Catholic principles that we hold in common are all very usefully true and can guide the discussion in a good way. And I think that's what the social teaching is good for. And I'm trying to get that across in the book. The second thing I would say is that I want readers to understand that the church does change its views. I mentioned this earlier. It learns from modernity, from the modern changes, the challenges, for example, of the role of women, or the challenges that come with, say, the expansion of education, the interest in ecology. And the church generally has become more sympathetic to modern ideas and modern thinking. And that's not a bad thing, because the motivations and the spirit of modernity, while it has many problems, many profound problems, where the church has a prophetic role of challenging it, these changes, it's appropriate to understand and respect the intentions and the actual accomplishments of the modern world. This makes the analysis more difficult than if we just reject it. But I think that's the idea that the teaching can change or evolve, at least without losing its fundamental truth, is one that I feel readers should get out of this. I also think this is the third point I would like to make, is that the social teaching is not the same as the moral teaching, as I keep saying, but it also is very close to it, and sometimes it does overlap. So, for example, the difference between men and women is an issue that's very controversial, and in some ways I feel the church hasn't finished its work on that topic, as is appropriate, because neither has modern society finished its experiment in figuring out what the difference between men and women is. But the church starts with a unshakable truth, a moral truth, if you will, that human nature is in some way male and female, and that there is some both unity and difference in that maleness and femaleness. And we have to work on that and understand it. But there is a kind of overlap there between the social teaching, what is the right role of women in society or men in society or in the family, and the actual moral teaching of this distinction, and that it certainly has some implications. You now have to figure them out. So that's three, and there's one more, but just to repeat the three principles so far that I want, the three things lessons I would like the readers to recognize. One is that this isn't a precise art of applying rules. The second, that the church has changed and the church's teachings evolves along with modernity. The third, that there is an overlap sometimes with moral teaching. And the fourth, which is really implicit in everything that I've said so far, is that the modern world, that the good and the bad are deeply entwined. You can't exactly separate them out and say, we accept only the good, we reject all of the bad in an easy way. What is good about the modern world, many things, for example, that were praised during the Second Vatican Council, desire for autonomy, of a good sort, as it put it in Gaudium et Spes, the advancement of knowledge, of freedom, of life expectancy, of prosperity, of life-fulfilling opportunities, all of those things are deeply entwined, cannot easily be separated from the bad things, the lack of respect for authority, the decline of the transcendental in horizon and in human experience, the rise of totalitarian governments. Those things are all part of the modern package. And what the Catholic social teaching is trying to do is to feel our way, if you will, through this sort of forest of good and bad ideas, this very thicket of notions and principles and practices in which the good and the bad are both very, very present. And so there's not ever going to be a perfect solution. I can't be an integralist saying that I want the church to in some way re-rule society, because that's not practical. I can't say that I want the church to abandon society, because that's not right. And I can't say that the church will always get the right answer first time, every time, and forever, because historical record shows that's not right either. What we're going to do is we're going to have to feel our way through this undergrowth, or this thicket of ideas and practices. And because there's no solution, we have to do what we can. We must always try. And Catholic social teaching does provide valuable counsels in this. And those are as the title says, these are the counsels of imperfection. We think our way through Catholic social teaching. So that's what I want to say. Thank you very much. And I think Stephen wants to give a little response.
Well, thank you, Edward. I should clarify that this is the light, rather than a halo, which lest there be any doubt about my authority in what I have to say. When I was a small child, my mother, whenever I was invited to a birthday party, my mother would always say to me, "Remember, it's not your party." And given that I never had a birthday party as a small child, that's true. This was doubly easy to remember, first of all, because, you know, I was well aware that it wasn't my party, but also that since it was a party, it therefore was not my party. But it also strikes me that book launches are, in a certain sense, the authorial equivalent of birthday parties. And I am well aware that this is not my party and that literally no one is here to listen to me. So I'm not going to speak for very long. Also on this analogy, it occurs to me that if the birthday is the book, the birthday boy is Edward, then I am sort of the man brought in to make some balloon animals. Again, not an intrinsically important, a sideshow at best in the proceedings, shall we say. Um, I should also say actually that I was asking how many people were coming to this tonight, and was amazed and delighted at how many are here. And I've just looked through the names, and it includes many of my favorite people. And my theory about why people attend book launches has always been that the main aim is to drink as much free alcohol as you can, while avoiding the eye of the person selling books, either because you have no intention of buying the book, or if you really were excited by the book, you've probably ordered it already cheaper on the internet. Now, obviously, an online book launch where we're not selling books and there is no free alcohol other than what you provide yourself, rather undercuts my theory of why anyone would come to a book launch. So it strikes me that the only reason that anyone would be here, and they are here in large numbers, would either because they're genuinely interested and or excited by the book, or they are eager to spend an evening in the company of Edward Hadas. Now, given that one of the very few pleasures in my drab life is spending evenings in the company of Edward Hadas, and it's been far too long given the pandemic, I can well appreciate this as a motivation. Nevertheless, I suspect that the former also plays a significant role, if a secondary one here too. And I'm here to tell you that if that's the case, then you are quite right to be here, because this really is a fantastic book. I had the pleasure of reading this a long time ago, it feels now, possibly in 2019 when it was in manuscript form, and thought it was wonderful, and urged the publisher that they had to publish it, and to publish it soon, because we needed it. And in fact, the situation that we're now in, arguably, given the national, international, global conversations about so many difficult questions of social, economic, political matters, including how these impinge upon, impact, correspond with, cooperate with religious groups, not least the church. These are all very pressing topics at the moment. You know, questions about healthcare provision, questions about vaccinations, questions about individuals sacrificing their own freedoms for the greater good, questions about to what extent can the civil authorities regulate the performance of religious ceremonies, and who may attend and in what capacities, and so many of the knotty, difficult, improvised on the spot, very often, questions about so many topics. Catholic social teaching has, if not a specific answer for the situation, because of course the situations constantly change, then a very rich body of sustained thought and prayer and debate that could contribute to our own discernment of what we ought to think about various topics. Now, there's many other things that I mean, the reason why I'm so enthusiastic about this book, and I've literally just, I mean, I've got a blurb on the back, but I've also just given it a 5-star review on Amazon as well. You know, it's a very comprehensive book. It's a beautifully written book. I mean, I think, you know, there's an argument that, you know, books on Catholic teaching should always be written by journalists because they can write. The Counsels of Imperfection, I think, is both a brilliant title, but, you know, I won't repeat them, but for the reasons that Edward states, is a perfect framing device for understanding the born-in-time nature of the church's social teaching. And it strikes me that this is something that the church is always very keen in its magisterial texts to flag up the fact that its social teaching is directed to specific moments, to specific times, to specific questions, and is not necessarily intended as a for the ages proclamation. The very fact that they've got out the habit, I think, but you know, the very fact that, you know, we had this tradition of popes updating Catholic social teaching and giving it a timestamp in the title. You know, we had Rerum Novarum, and then 40 years, and then 80 years, 100 years. Caritas in Veritate was meant to be 120 whatever years, but I believe it's right. I'm right in saying that it got delayed because of the crash, and it was specifically delayed because there were new things to comment on and to take into account. So the bounded and historically contingent and thus fallible and provisional nature of Catholic social teaching is critical, and it's critical for understanding the history of it, but it's also critical for understanding the application in the future, and this comes throughout Edward's book. And the other example that I always like to quote of this is that, you know, we think of Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution of the church in the modern world is how the title is always translated, which makes it sound like this for the ages pronouncement on how the church is to engage with the secular world, you know, from the time of the Enlightenment until, you know, the present and beyond. But of course, the title of Gaudium et Spes in the Latin reads, and you'll have to, I normally apologize for my Latin pronunciation, but it strikes me that the person who taught me Latin, Father Richard Finn, is chairing this session. So I'll make no apologies and in fact be bullish in the truth and perfection of my Latin pronunciation on this occasion. In mundo huius temporis, which of course means in the world of this day, of the present day, not the modern world of the present time. So Gaudium et Spes, despite issuing with all the, you know, for the ages nature, I mean, there's qualifications to be added to the boundedness of conciliar teachings, but again, the truth is in the title that these are meant to speak to specific realities in the contingencies of history. And I think that, I mean, it's not true to say that this is the only book on Catholic social teaching that does this, but I think that this insight is woven throughout the book and forms one of its essential guiding leitmotifs. And the other one I wanted to flag up really, although Edward just has, which means that you know, the two things I wanted to say, you know, one of them has already been said better already, but I think it really is important, the link that is stressed between, you know, social teaching in inverted commas and moral teaching in inverted commas, and these two cannot be separated. They neither really makes proper sense without the other. And if you're reading a text that, you know, you might think is, you know, a classic statement of the moral teaching, Humanae Vitae, for example, then what you find is that you get paragraphs in it addressing precisely, well, what will happen if we change, you know, this understanding of acts between husbands and wives, ideally. But if we change the understanding and the understanding of the nature of the conjugal act, then these are the bigger social repercussions that one would expect to see. And it, you know, again, this is not the occasion to dwell on this point, but many of which then came to pass. And likewise, the encyclical Populorum Progressio, which Paul VI publishes the year before Humanae Vitae, although given the long gestation of Humanae Vitae, you know, these were certainly both written around, you know, the same time as each other. You know, this seems to be a very classic statement of church social teaching, looking at the big picture. But of course, and this becomes clear when you look at it with Humanae Vitae, that one of the big questions at the time around contraception was precisely thinking about population control. And, you know, Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, I think, was published in 1967, 1968. So precisely this question about economic and social development in the developing world, the third world, and the impact that population would have on that, in turn affected by decisions around family planning. There's an intimate connection between these two topics, even in this one, you know, sphere of Catholic social teaching, and this gets written right the way through. In fact, there's a lovely quotation, if I can find it again. Maybe I can't. Just to end with, that there's a beautiful statement that Edward makes that I probably can't find, knowing me. But it was just a statement underlining the importance that, here we go, this is from page 374, a brief, cheerful conclusion. And again, the levity that Edward brings to some of this is very welcome. The family teaching can be considered the core and culmination of all the social teaching. Without it, the counsels on the economy, government, and everything else would not merely be imperfect. They are, after all, counsels of imperfection by nature. Without the family teaching, the rest of the social teaching would be stranded and incomplete. Both of them need the other. And of course, this builds upon a very Catholic understanding of the nature of humanity, and the idea that man is both a social animal, as Thomas quotes from Aristotle, but equally that society is itself built out of not just individuals, but smaller groups of human beings, the family being the base unit of them. And again, this is where we get ideas such as subsidiarity flowing from. It's where we get the idea in Benedict XVI's Caritas in Veritate, when he says that no man is an island, but of course it follows also that no island is, you know, anything other than the aggregate good of the individuals and groups that make up that island. And so there's this constant dialectic throughout social teaching that I think Edward and this book bring out beautifully. So I cannot recommend this book highly enough. It's a great honor to have been asked by Edward to, you know, give some rambling remarks after his beautiful presentation, and it's also a delight to be back at Blackfriars, however virtually, which is a place that holds such an important place in the life of me and my wife. So it's a delight to be back here. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for that. And also thank you to Edward for presenting the book. I think it's very good to think of this as a sort of birthday party, but it is a birthday party, not just with balloons, but with some good questions. And I'd like to read out a question for maybe Edward to comment on first of all, and I would encourage others to put any questions they might have in the question and answer box using the facility on Zoom. So this question says, I understand that the 4 elements you developed give CST some protection not to fall into ideology, but mustn't there be more that makes CST different from any other doctrine of fundamental guidelines that evolved over time in dialogue with modernity and admits imperfections?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not quite sure what the other doctrines would be in terms of that the questioner has in mind, but I think that that it's important to think in terms of CST that you have this deposit of you have this deposit of faith, as it were, this understanding of human nature that's unchanging. And I mean, I talk in the first chapter about the vision of human nature in three sections of pre-fallen, how we are, and as God made us, how we are. The second was as fallen, and then this idea, the Christian idea, that we have a call to be redeemed and are redeemed. And I think that Christian anthropology, which becomes very quickly a Christian sociology and a Christian family teaching, because it has to do with how we're called to love in the image of the Trinitarian God, and how sin is a line that goes through all of this. That gives a kind of timelessness to the Catholic response to modernity that all other responses are bound by things that are themselves tend to be very modern. And I would also perhaps say that there is a kind of openness to the new in Catholicism and Christian particularly. I mean, that's not the common image. Of course, the common image is that the Catholic Church is always stuck in the Middle Ages, but that's very unfair. There is a sense in which, because of the confidence in the eternal truths that the Church has, it's particularly open to innovations in society for the good. This idea of building the city of man as best you can, and of responding to the world in a loving and sacrificial and yet wise way, is distinctly Catholic, or distinctly Christian, and I think in many ways distinctly Catholic. And so I try to bring that into the book as much as I can. And so I think there is something going on there that one can say being a Catholic provides a useful introduction. Maybe just very quickly to say, for example, the dignity of humanity and its many dimensions featured in my response to the COVID pandemic, because I thought that was something that a lot of the response, that the government restrictions seemed to be very unaware of the difference between being alive physically and the kind of richness of life that humanity is called for in its God-seeking nature. And I thought that was an idea that it's obviously not distinctly and totally Christian or Catholic, but I think the Christian understanding has a deeper and more and deeper and wider understanding of human dignity than is really possible in the secular imagination. Okay. So
there's another question really to do with thinking about CST, accepting what you say about the Counsels of Imperfection, and accepting also what Stephen said about, as it were, the present day nature of Catholic social teaching. What about the need to repeat Catholic social teaching? For example, the teaching of Rerum Novarum is still utterly relevant, even though the social background today is completely different.
Well, I think to say that the teaching of Rerum Novarum is completely relevant is an exaggeration, to be honest. I think it was written before the advent of welfare states. It was written in a time when there was still, in the richest countries in the world, massive, I don't mean 5%, but 30, 50% of the people living in quite miserable conditions. It was written when labor unions were very strong, when the ideology of communism and socialism seemed very promising to a lot of people. It just can't be the case that a document written in response to that world can be, in a perfect sense, relevant today. It's not to say there aren't wise things in there. There are many wise things, and many things that you can learn from now. But I think to read a document like that as if it were, timeless, is to do it in injustice. It's about things that were new. I mean, particularly it's the title, the Rerum Novarum, is used because they were new. And it's, those things are now, many of them don't exist anymore. They were new and changed or disappeared. And some of them, there are many other new things that in some way modify the teachings of the understanding of Rerum Novarum. So I know that a lot of people are very fond of using that document, and also some of Leo XIII, the author's other encyclicals, as sort of the core texts of Catholic social teaching. But in honesty, I just don't really find that very compelling, because they're taken from such a different world in relevant ways to how we can respond to, say, democracy or sexual equality or even economic issues. So some of the things that he says about private property are still extremely relevant. But the church spent the next century kind of backtracking on some of the things that are said about private property and the relationship with the importance of the universal destination of goods, which Leo pays tribute to, but clearly thinks is a less current issue than the defense of private property and socialism. So yeah, I guess I'm not terribly sympathetic to that argument. And if I were teaching Catholic social teaching via encyclicals, I would certainly read Rerum Novarum, but I wouldn't linger on it particularly long time, because I think that it is, in that sense, not the most current document and not necessarily the most helpful.
Okay, let's now turn to a very practical question. Would it be a useful exercise to assemble a panel of experts on CST, so yourself and Stephen and various others, and would give you a set of current practical problems to try and solve?
I'd love it. It would be great fun. And I assure you that the result would be, depending on who was invited, a bitter fight, and we'd probably end up trying hard to stay friends and have drinks afterwards, because we come to these things with very different ideas, even sharing the Catholic part. But that's not a bad thing. That's the point I would make. Is I think that you could learn a lot from listening to other people. I've already done some presentations with people on panels on various social issues, and there's a lot to be learned from within this tradition that I think is very good. And I would love to have more of this. There are some Vatican groups that are involved in things like this, but the more the better.
I think I'd be up for it if it was like like The Apprentice, and we had the two teams, and we actually had to put it in action and actually see, if it worked. And Ruth Kelly could be the Alan Sugar figure and Hire and Fire. That'd be amazing. Let's do that.
You're on. Now, I'm allowed to mention the name of the next question. This is a question from Timothy Radcliffe. Timothy says, I was interested in the remarks about the non-ideological nature of CTS. What role might it have in leading Catholics beyond the ideological divisions which afflict the church in some places?
Well, like the whole United States, for example, would be a place where we could do with some ideological thinking. I think that's a very good question. I think, in a sense, that's one of the real challenges, to get people to see that the church, that this teaching is really isn't ideological in the sense of left wing or right wing, and that it isn't an unconditional defense of what used to be called the American way of life, or an unconditional condemnation of what used to be called the American way of life. And so it would be helpful, but I have to say I'm not enormously optimistic on this. I'm on various distribution lists for Catholic social teaching organizations. And it's still rather a dialogue of the deaf, of people or ships passing in the night. I'm not sure how we talk about it, but of people just sort of a lot of left-wing or right-wing or free market rhetoric that's kind of got glossed over with some Catholic terminology, rather than some the kind of intense criticism of modern society of all sorts, and the intense praise of different parts of modern society that I think is a much more appropriate way of using the teaching. So it should be done, but I'm not sure if we are really doing it yet.
Okay, another question has come in. Do you agree that CST is fundamentally reactive rather than proactive in relation to the issues in the contemporary world? And if so, is that a problem?
Yes and no would be the answer to those two questions. I think it has always been somewhat reactive relative to proactive. And I think that's somewhat the nature of the church, in the sense that the church in the modern world, because the modern world has basically been turning away from the church for the last 2 centuries. And so it's been, I say at the very beginning, that the church has been more changed and challenged by modernity than changing and challenging it. And I think you just have to admit that and say that to a very large extent, the social teaching is a response to the changes in society. But I think that's a slight, in a way you can misunderstand that. So for example, Stephen was talking about, he was alluding to not just the understanding of the Marriage Act itself, but of the whole notion of the role of sexuality in society. And when Paul VI talks about what happens when you change the understanding of the Marriage Act. And so it was certainly a response from the beginning. I mean, the first defense against artificial contraception was from the 30s, after the Anglicans had tentatively endorsed it. It was a response to social changes. But on the other hand, the teaching that emerges is in many ways a prophetic challenge to all understandings, both old and new. So in that sense, it is ahead of, it's proactive against, towards what's happening in society. Is it bad that it's reactive? No, not at all. I mean, it's bad when it's slow. And I would come back to my example of anti-Semitism, which is genuinely one of the most shocking and awful pieces of, certainly in the last few hundred years of the church's history, the incapacity to see the danger of anti-Semitism in the 20th century, really until after the Second World War was over. The first real statements about it that have any heft come in the 1960s. And indeed, one of the reasons they're so late is the church really has to consciously say that we have made errors, which is something that the magisterium is extremely loath to do until very recently. So, sometimes that reactive nature allows it to dodge issues where it should have responded more quickly. And it also less noxiously say, I don't think the church has really responded well to, I have 2 examples in the book, the rise of urbanization, the move from 10% of the population of the world living in cities to over half now, or the incredible increase in leisure, entertainment, travel, activities that barely existed as mass activities, really barely existed past a very narrow elite frame 50 or 100 years ago, and now take up a lot of people's lives. We live for the weekend and that sort of culture. And to try and think that through and what it means for Catholics, because it's reactive, it's been rather slow it's been able to dodge those things because it just chooses not to react. And so I think that's a disadvantage. But overall, reactive isn't necessarily a bad thing.
I think if I might jump in, I think the one area where I would at least argue that the church is ahead of the time, if not leading the way, but certainly foreseeing issues and flagging up challenges and opportunities. It's in the area of what the church always calls social communications. The papal teaching on the television, and then Vatican II on social, and then on the digital communications on World Digital Day or whatever it does every year, is really profound and really far-sighted. And people tend to miss this because they always have this idea that the Catholic Church kind of, engages with technology very late in the day, and because religious groups do. But in fact, what you tend to see, since at least Gutenberg, is the church at the vanguard of technology because it sees it as a vehicle for getting its message out. So, you get the church, founding an international radio station very early. You get, Pope Leo XIII being on film. You get the Vatican making a website, before the BBC and CNN. I don't think they've changed the aesthetic of it since, but they got there. So I think there's certain areas. I absolutely agree with Edward about the general reactive nature, and actually that being a good thing. But there are areas within the church's social purview. Human trafficking might be another one, at least now, if not in the past, where it, if not at the very forefront, it's certainly not in the chasing pack, as it often seems to be on certain other questions.
Yeah, I would add migration.
In the peloton,
Yeah, no, I would add migration to that, where the church has had a very clear, I have that in the book, a section on migration. It's had a very clear, insightful teaching on migration that starts, in a way, it starts in the 19th century, but a very clear document from Pius XII in the 40s, and has stayed the course on that, and has really been a very prophetic voice, well ahead of a lot of the political controversies that we've seen. And even if you're, well, probably especially if you're not keen on some of the ways that Francis talks about this, that means all the more you should read it and think about it, because it is a very clear and prophetic teaching. So there are ways in which, the church remains ahead of the time, or at the cutting edge of modern notions.
Okay, one more question I think we have time for. Professor Hadas, you have insisted on how Christian moral and social teachings are necessarily intertwined. You have also insisted on understanding the contingent character of the social teachings. Would you also say that Catholic moral teachings are contingent as well, entirely or partially?
No, no. The moral teachings are not contingent. That said, one has to think of, say, a teaching about the death penalty. That's a social teaching. But it has a moral aspect, to be sure. Like, we have a moral teaching that you shall not kill, that human life is sacred. And so if you're going to defend the death penalty on a social teaching basis, you're going to have to deal with this moral teaching that it seems to violate, which has been done in various ways over various centuries. And the teaching on the death penalty has changed. The church's teaching has changed dramatically. And I trace it out quite quickly in the book, but it's been one of the more remarkable changes, because it was a liberal idea that the church rejected the abolition of the death penalty, although some of its original proponents were Catholics. But it was roundly rejected as a sort of disrespect for the sanctity of human life to not have the state wield the sword, as Paul says. And then John Paul II basically reversed course from what Pius XII had said as recently as the 1950s about the nature of the teaching on the death penalty. But the basic moral principles that go into that debate have never changed. So in that sense, you might look like you're changing your moral teaching, but the moral teachings of the church are fundamental. They are like the Christological or Trinitarian teachings. The doctrine may develop in the sense that Newman talks about, but they don't change in that way. It's only the implications in society that can change.
Okay, perhaps I might at this point ask Stephen if having listened to that sort of discussion and contributed to it, do you have any kind of concluding remarks you would like to make, Stephen?
I think the only concluding remark to make is that, I mean, it seems to me that discussion has been a yet greater advert for buying the book and hearing more of Edward's wisdom. And you know, you can get Edward's thoughts on things while in the bath or on the bus, or you know, that this is a compendium of Edward Hadas's nuggets, which frankly, who wouldn't want that?
Stephen, I didn't invite, I asked Stephen to do this, but the point was not to have encomiums on me. This is a little bit on the blushing side here, but thank you, it's very kind.
On which happy note, I think I'd like to thank all our participants, all our attendees this evening, especially, of course, all those who put questions. I'd like a special thanks to Stephen for his response, and of course to Edward, and to renew our congratulations to him on this super book. And well, we look forward to the next book. And if it hasn't been possible to celebrate this book launch with the customary range of drinks and social conversations, I very much hope by the time that the next book comes out, we shall be able to do this both online and those of us who can join together at Blackfriars to do that as well, and to toast your achievements, Edward. Thank you very much for everything this evening.
You're all very kind. Thank you.